Okay, so what happened in Ashkenaz after this brief but powerful punctuation of violence that erupted in 1096? There are a couple of really important cultural, socioeconomic, and religious responses that you see over the next century or so. And I think they kind of charted a vector for Ashkenazic Jewry to follow that we still see the impact of them today. The first is a movement called the Hasidei Ashkenaz. The term Hasid, of course, is used with regards the Hasidim of the 18th century and onward, like the Chabad Hasidim and Vizhnitz and Satmar and so on. These are not the same Hasidim. They use the same term, but it's a completely separate movement. The Hasidei Ashkenaz are, the word Hasid means pious one. The Hasidei Ashkenaz were a movement that gained strength in the 50 years following the Crusades, primarily in Mainz. One of the most important literary figures is Yehuda Chassid. It's a multi-generational family commitment to this particular movement, and he wrote the book shown on the left here called Sefer Hasidim. What is fascinating about this brief-lived movement in Jewish intellectual history is that, unlike anything since we saw in the Dead Sea Scrolls community, and maybe some elements we'll see later when we get to Tzfat and the Kabbalists there, but they emphasized themes of self-denial, lots of fasting, literal, rolling in snow to repent for things, an elevation of the concept of martyrdom. Not surprising when you're talking about a community that's only a few decades away from this explosion of violence in the end of the 11th century. But the movement simply did not catch on after a couple hundred years, and it sort of died out naturally, with the big exception of this particular book, Sefer Hasidim, which is an amazing book. It's kind of complicated. It's probably put together from different pieces, maybe not all by Yehuda Chassid, but I will mention one passage that you may be familiar with. It is widely reprinted. I have a modern printing in my own home today. Yehuda Chassid left a fairly extensive will, an ethical will, for his descendants that lists all kinds of very special practices that they are to engage in. One of my favorite ones, which you've probably heard of, is Rabbi Yehuda Chassid says famously to his sons that none of them should marry a woman who has the same name as their mother, right? And this is something that, for whatever reason, is so widespread in the Jewish world that if a man meets a young woman and his mother's name is Chana and her name is Chana, so she will add a name like Chana Sarah. She'll change her name, so it's not exactly the same as his mother's. Same thing with women marrying men who have the same name as their fathers. And one of the ironic things is that there's no source for this idea anywhere in the Torah. Nowhere in the Talmud, nowhere in Midrash. It's like the only source for this is in his particular will from the 12th century. And the famous Kotzker Rebbe, a Hasidic rabbi in the 19th century with an incredibly acerbic wit, he once said that if Yehuda Chassid had known how strictly people would adhere to the instructions in his will, he would have included the 10 Commandments in there too. Yeah, I think that's really funny. So Hasidic Ashkenaz picks up this strong element of self-mortification with all kinds of strange practices, like, for example, after a person dies, putting in their will that they want their coffin dragged along the ground, not carried to the cemetery to atone for their sins, and strange measures of fasting to atone for sins, calculating the value of a sin in terms of literally caloric value and then paying for it with calories. It's kind of like an unpopular diet. But this is all told, it was really influential for about 150 years, but it kind of like flourishes right after the Crusades. Another thing we should recall is that, the major violence was 1096. But the incidence of violence would continue for various reasons over the next few hundred years. We are going to explore shortly medieval anti-Semitism, which is not something that we've talked about extensively before, and it was getting pretty nasty. It was shortly after the Crusades that you have the first charge of ritual murder, this bizarre idea that Jews need to reenact the crucifixion of Jesus by, God forbid, killing a small child. That occurs in England in 1144, and then added to that, you have this strange concept that the Jews somehow need to consume human blood, a total absurdity and a lie. But nevertheless, these kinds of things simply keep developing and developing. And I believe that the Crusades mark a turning point in Ashkenazic culture in which Jews begin to become much more insular. They begin to regard the outside world as far more toxic, as they regard the possibility of reasonable cultural exchange with non-Jews as less and less of a possibility. And they start to fold their culture inwards, looking inside at each other, much less than looking to the outside world. Hopefully over the next few weeks, we'll have the opportunity to explore this thesis and see if it makes sense, especially when contrast with the Sephardic experience, in which they did not have this same kind of like sharp break until you get to the expulsion of 1492, half a millennium later. I think one of the ways in which we see this, and you'll forgive me because this is kind of a new idea for me and I have not fleshed it out totally, but you see it somewhat in the generational shift between the era of Rashi. Rashi was a very old man when the Crusades occurred. It's very near the end of his life. And his grandchildren and the larger school that developed around them known as Tosafot. Rashi is typically printed on the inside binding of every Talmudic page, and his grandchildren and their school's commentary on the outside of the Talmudic page. And one of the big differences is that Rashi, as a stylist, tends to be much more straightforward, holding your hand, explaining things one word at a time, one concept at a time, and he seems to be much more open to the simple translation of the text. Tosfot, on the other hand, you see there is a much more inward-looking perspective as the entire world of reality revolves around the text in various places in the Talmud. Whereas Rashi says, what does it say on this page? I'm going to explain it to you. This means this, here, this means this, and so on. Tosfot says, hey, how can what it says here be true when 500 pages later in the Talmud, we see something that implies the opposite? And tying together these big analytical links throughout the entire document sort of creates like an internal web of meaning that is entirely self-dependent on the text. Does not necessarily reach for scientific evidence or geographic evidence or anything like that, but the arguments are all kind of like internal and self-reinforcing. And I would like to argue that the European Tosafot represent a literary example, an intellectual example of that turn inwards that we see in Ashkenazic culture that would ultimately have kind of like an explosion when they finally do release themselves to the outside world in the 18th and 19th century in particular. But that brings me to the end of my presentation. I want to thank you very much for your attention. And for those of you who need to leave, of course, Zoom class dismissed. And for those of you who want to hang around for questions, I'm really happy to talk a little further.